As school buildings sat empty during the first year of the pandemic,
I am so lonely.
kids struggled.
This is just like soul crushing.
With COVID and virtual learning and isolation from your friends, it's tough on a kid.
We found after London passed that 2 of her friends were also suicidal.
If we don't find like a solution soon, we're going to lose a lot of kids.
And coming back to school was not easy.
We have students that, are being physical towards staff, biting, kicking, scratching.
Teachers have been hurt, kids have been hurt. I've seen kids savagely beaten in the hallway.
Every day they came home, it was like, oh, there was 4 fights, there were 7 fights, there was 2 fights.
We've seen a huge uptick in mood disorders with kids.
These kids are suffering. These kids are really suffering.
Now, things are starting to look brighter.
Who's excited about doing their mantras? Fabulous.
But there's still a long way to go.
We're kind of riding the ship of students going back to a normalcy.
Well, Portland Public Schools gave us access.
Christine Pitawanich brings us part 1 of a 5-part series, Counseled, Inside Our Schools. Here's the story.
Portland Public Schools, the largest district in Oregon, is home to roughly 42,000 students scattered over 81 schools. We followed 3 school counselors at Sitton Elementary in St. John's, West Sylvan Middle in the Southwest Hills, and Lincoln High School downtown.
Our apology should come from where? Our what? Our heart. Our heart.
Hi, you guys.
We're kind of riding the ship of students going back to a normalcy.
Mental health professionals have agreed there were issues before that the pandemic made worse.
Hi.
As students get more accustomed to fully in-person school this year, Deb Bloom, a counselor at Sitton Elementary, says staff have worked really hard to make kids feel welcome and at ease here.
We really focused on empathy and really understanding other people's feelings.
The same is true at both the middle and high school levels.
We've had to be so creative in order to reach kids. Like, we had to create systems so that this new environment, like some kids hadn't been ever in middle school, so we had to make it like even more welcoming and more embracing to their needs.
The more we're back in person, I've seen less mental health concerns.
But those mental health issues are still there. School counselors, who often work alongside teachers, are literally having to teach kids how to interact with adults and each other. They're often the first line of defense, helping kids who are struggling. A counselor's scope of work is broad and can cover everything from suicide to college applications. With hundreds of students under their care, the work is challenging but fulfilling.
Mental health is everyone's business.
We want to be foundational for students' academic and emotional health.
The best job in the entire world.
Christine joins me now. Super interesting story. And I noticed those 3 schools, they're all on the west side. Why is that?
Portland Public Schools gave us access to those schools, and this has been months in the making. So once they said, hey, here are the schools, we thought, okay, let's jump on it. But we know parents have told us they believe, some do anyway, that the west side schools are just treated differently than the east side schools. So I reached out to a Portland Public Schools teacher that I had had contact with over the course of the pandemic, teaches mostly kind of on the east side, and they did corroborate what these counselors were telling me.
So it's pretty much the same. They say west side or east side schools.
In terms of how kids are doing, basically better than last year.
Okay, well, that's great to hear. You also mentioned in there that the teachers are teaching the kids how to interact with each other. Break that down. What does that mean?
I mean, I guess, maybe we'd think of these as kind of simple techniques, really conflict resolution techniques to make sure kids don't escalate in terms of arguments, start yelling at each other, start fighting, because what we saw last school year when kids were just coming back for in-person learning after a couple of years learning, at home from distance, they didn't really know how to interact with each other. They didn't know what was okay behavior at school. So I think this year there's a huge effort to, one, promote connectiveness among kids and teachers and just the whole school community, and also make sure that these kids know how to resolve conflict.
Yeah, all right, sounds good. Sounds like a fascinating series. Really looking forward to it. Thank you, Christine. Christine's series, Counseled, Inside Our Schools, airs all this week on The Story. We'll be going into an elementary school tomorrow and sitting down with the kids there and the counselors as well. Thanks a lot, Christine.
Yeah.
Moving on, right now in Salem, legislative leaders are talking about a bill that could bring the biggest change in land use laws in Oregon in 50 years. Now, I know that's not exactly thrilling and doesn't have all of you jumping off your couch or out of your chair saying, oh my gosh, but seriously, really, this is a big deal. It's aimed at helping expand the state's silicon forest by making land quickly available for the semiconductor industry. Here's a live look at the committee right now. They're meeting in Salem. And yeah, okay, they could look a bit subdued, but I assure you, the topic they are discussing is downright explosive. They're talking about giving Governor Tina Kotek superpowers. I'm not kidding. When it comes to land use, it would allow her to designate certain plots of land needed for chip factories and take away the land use restrictions that would ordinarily make it impossible to build there. So, for example, if there's 500 acres of farmland in Hillsboro where chip companies want to expand, but the farm is outside the urban growth boundary, and that means they can't touch it, it has to be reserved for agriculture, well, now, no problem. The governor can wave a wand and take away the restrictions, allowing the building of that semiconductor plant. It's all fueled by the federal CHIPS bill passed by Congress last year. That authorized $52 billion in grants in an attempt to rebuild American-based manufacturing in the semiconductor industry. Check this out. Only 10% of the world's supply are made here in America. The majority, around 75%, come from East Asia. This past Friday, 4 lawmakers, 3 from the Joint Committee on Semiconductors, took a tour of the HP facility in Corvallis to see some chips up close for themselves. They kept us out of the building. Thanks, fellas. They also toured the Oregon State University building. It's a incubator right across the street, which is also focused on the semiconductor industry. Both groups said they were applying for those federal CHIPS grants. Afterwards, lawmakers told us it is clear Oregon has to change some land use laws if we're going to compete for that federal money, that there simply are no large plots of land that would work right now.
Our Oregon's land use system is about 50 years old, and there's some restrictions that it causes and very slow processes. And if we're going to bring this kind of industry, grow this industry in our area, we're going to have to be able to have land for it.
I heard that from a lot of folks. Senator Janine Salman, a Democrat from Hillsboro, is one of the co-chairs on this Joint Committee on Semiconductors. They've created something called Senate Bill 4, which has all the language that'll make this happen. She said the state is losing companies because there's no land to build on.
This is an ecosystem that we're trying to build, and we realize that we really can't have one without the other. So really making sure that we're hearing from companies that are wanting to come and invest in Oregon that we don't have the land space. And so we've put together this joint committee that the presiding officers did under the governor's recommendation, putting together the joint committee so that we can really act rapidly to address all of these issues. And land use is an important component of that.
Senator Salman works for an education technology company. She's a strong supporter, as you would expect, of the semiconductor industry. But making a major land use change, that is not a small thing. So she was asked if it really is a good idea to change land use laws that some feel really are sacred here in Oregon and make the state a unique and incredible place. I got to tell you, her answer, it's a bit tortured, and it made me wonder if she's trying to convince us or herself that it's okay.
We want to make sure that Oregonians value the land system that we have. We have 362 miles of public beach that's protected. We want to make sure that we protect those. But in this specific instance, we realize that we have to make some decisions and we need some triggers in order to bring industry here to develop in Oregon. We can't have all of these other things in place without having a place for them to land. And we've heard from cities that they've had to turn away companies from investment. But we want to make sure that as the values as leaders, that we have we have said that we want to protect farmland, we want to protect water, we want to protect our air. Those aren't things that we want to negotiate on, but I don't think it's an and or. I think we want to make sure that we're looking at this as to where the best investment is, and that you can and meet the criteria of the CHIPS Act, where the investors are going to come.
The other co-chair on the Joint Committee on Semiconductors is Representative Janelle Bynum from the Clackamas area. She's also a Democrat. She said the Joint Committee is focused on many things, including an educational pipeline for future high-tech workers.
So we're talking about shared prosperity. We're talking about talent development. We're talking about site readiness. We're talking about how we actually put land in a bundle to make it marketable. And then we're also talking about how do you get 91 people to agree on something that is so monumental, where they each come from a different point of view. That's the task at hand, and it's a big lift, but we're here to do it.
Bynum has a degree in electrical engineering. She said Oregon's semiconductor industry does need to grow.
We shouldn't walk away from our silicon forest like we did 20 years ago when I came here. I'm an engineer, and there was nothing for me. We shouldn't walk away from that investment again.
So here's what we've learned. Oregon lawmakers are on the verge of passing a bill that would change part of Oregon's land use law created 50 years ago. It would give the governor the power to decide where a chip plant can be built, and it would not matter if that land was outside the urban growth boundary and restricted. She could designate 2 plots of land if they're each 500 acres, and many more if they're smaller. The bill also sets aside $200 million for companies that want to apply for the federal CHIPS Act money. That $200 million is to be used for preparing a site for a new chip plant, or research and development, or partnering with higher ed to help train future workers. So, what do you think about all this? Do you want to give up some land for the Silicon Forest and money and jobs that it will no doubt bring? Or do you want to stay with the farmland just as it is now? Send us an email, will you? Send it to thestory@kgw.com or call and leave a voicemail, 503-226-5090. I look forward to hearing from you. Let's switch it up now and tell you about a problem that at its core really affects every single one of us. The state of Oregon has one of the worst weather radar coverage gaps in the country. I didn't know that, did you? And we're not blaming the forecast of the monstrous snowstorm recently on that lack of weather radar, but that surprise storm is what sparked the idea to look into this story. If you travel south to Lincoln City, there's a huge gap in the radar coverage meteorologists use there, and there's another gap in Central Oregon as well. Meteorologist Joe Ranieri tells us if better radar could have helped ahead of that snowstorm and what it means for future forecasts.
A better radar coverage would have definitely helped a couple of weeks ago when we saw that cold air move in and of course saw that heavy snow move throughout much of the metro area. But there is a nearly 200-mile stretch along the Oregon coast where there is no coverage at all, from the central Oregon coast all the way down to the southern Oregon coast.
Last month's snowstorm was legendary, shutting down the city and forcing drivers to abandon their cars along the side of highways and freeways.
Certainly would have helped in the short range. Now, I'm not saying it would help in the 48-hour forecast, it won't. But for the 0 to 6 or 12 hours, having a coastal radar could have been useful.
This record-breaking snowstorm that dropped nearly a foot of snow at the Portland International Airport and nearly 8 inches in downtown was tough to track. One part of the problem, Oregon's radar system.
Well, it's so bad because the radars aren't there that need to cover that region, and the fact we have terrain which blocks the radar. So, we have the Cascades that are very effective in blocking radar at low levels, and the coastal range.
I'll admit it wasn't just the poor radar system to blame for the high snowfall totals, but it's a well-known fact that our radar coverage in Oregon is the worst in the lower 48 states. Just take a look at this map that shows how big the gap is in coverage along parts of the coast.
There's a Portland radar, which sees the Willamette Valley, but is essentially blocked at low levels by the coastal range.
Dr. Cliff Mass, a professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle, says there's about 200 miles of coastline that doesn't get picked up by radar.
That's the problem. If there's a convective line coming in, or a unforeseen low pressure center, or whatever, you can't see it coming in on the Oregon coast.
Case in point, the Manzanita tornado back in the fall of 2016, when residents only got alerts on their phones that a tornado was coming.
So the only real coastal coverage right now in the Northwest is from the Langley Hill radar, which we put in. There was a lot of work to get that radar, and that's at Hoquiam.
It's not an easy fix. A new radar for the coast would cost millions of dollars.
I have one plan in which we get the radar on Mount Ashland and near Medford, which is not doing very well because it's so high. Move that to the coast and put a less expensive radar there in Medford.
Mass says it'll take political movement to get things done.
You need your U.S. senators from Oregon to push this very hard. It could happen, but they will have to do that.
There's also a gap in coverage in parts of central Oregon. Right now, there are 3 radar sites in Oregon, one not far from us along Highway 30 near Scappoose, near Pendleton, and another in Medford. In downtown Portland, Joe Ranieri, KGW News.
Well, Joe certainly knows a thing or two about weather around here, and so does this guy, Chief Meteorologist Matt Zaffino. You've been thinking about that radar gap for some time.
Oh, yeah, Pat. This has been in discussion within the meteorological community in Oregon for quite some time now, and there have been efforts underway to try to fill the gap and get a weather radar sited on the Oregon coast. But as Dr. Mass said, it takes a lot of political will to make that happen. And so far, the effort has been stuck, I don't know, in Congress or somewhere. So let's go back to the map here and talk about the gaps that we have in Oregon. The one in central Oregon is problematic in the wintertime. In the summertime, when we get big thunderstorms, those develop high enough in the atmosphere that the Medford and the Pendleton radars can see most of those. It's really a cold season issue here where we miss things because that's happening at lower elevations and the radar beam shoots over the top of the weather. And then there's the gap here on the coast that Joe was discussing in his story. Now, if you look at the Langley Hill radar, which is the new one on the Washington coast, the next one on the coast is all the way down at Eureka, California. That's a 450-mile stretch between the radar sites. There is coverage there. And in fact, the Manzanita tornado that Joe also referenced, that was warned off of the Langley Hill or the Washington coast radar. Even though the Portland radar is closer, the warnings were generated by the information coming from that Washington coast radar. So that's how valuable they are. Other storms have been missed because of that gap in coverage there on the coast of Oregon. So it is a big deal here. Now, I'm going to zoom out a bit. Let's look at the East Coast. Don't see any gaps here, do we? No. Now, look, there's a lot more people that live here, and they have to worry about hurricanes. But I tell you what, there is 0 gaps in coverage in the east, and the big gaps are all here in the west. There's also a big gap in Nevada, sparsely populated, okay, maybe, but not so much anymore as things continue to grow. Now, Dr. Mass's idea, and I love the creative thinking about moving that Medford radar. It's on the top of Mount Ashland. If you've ever skied there, you've seen it. It's that big white ball. But he's right. It sits at 7,500 feet, which is great for the Rogue Valley for covering severe thunderstorms in the summer. Can see those really well. But that's exactly why that's never going to get moved. They need that there to cover those severe storms in the summer across southern Oregon here. So for the gap on the coast of Oregon, Pat, again, it's going to take a lot of political will. You got any?
Well, yeah, but I mean, let's do it. How much does it cost to put a radar up? Get a tower and a ball and off you go.
You know what? I actually spoke to the head of the National Weather Service, the guy that is in charge of remote sensing. This would be his purview, this kind of equipment, right? And I was down at Cape Canaveral actually covering the launch of the new weather satellite that was happening back in 2016. And I asked him about this, and he kind of just alluded to, we're kind of going away from terrestrial-based sensing or remote sensing devices because they're expensive, so to speak. However, if you look at the cost of one tornado or one storm, it'll far outweigh the cost of putting in a radar. You have to maintain it, of course, so there's an annual cost in maintaining a radar and the upgrades and everything that goes with it. But the let's do it attitude, yeah, we're all for it, but it's a big get.
Yeah, man, it's okay, not going to happen. All right, thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.
You bet.
Up next on the story, a tranquilizer used by veterinarians is now on the streets, being mixed with hard drugs like fentanyl. And the side effects are downright frightening.
It's kind of a breakdown of the skin's immune system, and it's horrific.
So is it already here in Portland? What a local expert has seen so far when the story returns. Earlier this month, the Food and Drug Administration announced it's taking steps to stop a drug called xylazine. It's being imported illegally into the U.S. It's a tranquilizer. It's used by veterinarians. But now it's being mixed with dangerous and often fatal drugs like fentanyl. As Catherine Cook reports, xylazine has already been detected in some overdose victims on the East Coast. And experts say just a matter of time before it comes to Portland.
It's the drug making headlines around the U.S. Some call it tranq, others the zombie drug. Its real name, xylazine, a veterinary medication used to sedate animals. On the black market, xylazine is acting like water on a grease fire in a country already fully engulfed in an opioid crisis. More deaths, more ODs, and in some users, a skin rash that can range from minor to severe.
The idea that skin ulcers that lead to surgeries, maybe even amputations, it's horrific.
Dr. Amanda Risser works at Central City Concern in Portland. She's Senior Medical Director of Substance Use Disorder Services. So far, she says xylazine doesn't appear to have reached Oregon's drug supply the way it's gripped other states. She's only heard of 2 possible but unconfirmed cases here. Right now, Risser and others in harm reduction are monitoring local drug supplies for xylazine and spreading the word among users.
It may be there, and just I'm not seeing the fallout yet. And so I think everyone is at risk for being exposed to xylazine when they're using opioids these days, just as everyone right now is being exposed to fentanyl.
As with so many drugs, Risser says those taking xylazine likely don't realize it. It's an adulterant, often mixed with fentanyl, which many users smoke. Some evidence shows xylazine causes users to become sleepier and more prone to overdose.
There's just a lot of stuff that happens when you make things in a lab.
And there are other complications that can lead to serious skin wounds like these. When users build tolerance to smoking the xylazine-laced drugs, many turn to injecting them. If xylazine is present, Risser says it can cause blood vessels to constrict, starving the skin of blood and oxygen.
All the things that, help you heal from a wound when it occurs or an infection. So it's kind of a breakdown of the skin's immune system.
As harm reduction networks prepare to treat those symptoms in Portland, they hope what they're seeing in other cities will help them to be ready. Catherine Cook, KTW.
That was Catherine Cook. According to the DEA, xylazine mixed with hard drugs started in the East Coast, spread south, and is now working its way west. In 2021, the DEA tracked more than 1,400 xylazine-positive overdose deaths in the South. That same year here in the West, there were 34. Coming up next on The Story, as many as 1 in 8 Oregonians sought food assistance last year. We'll tell you how you can help this year. Do you have a Roku or Amazon Fire? If you do, you can watch today's show plus previous shows and segments anytime. It's on our streaming service. Go to your Roku or Fire homepage and then just add KGW Plus to your home screen. And then let us know what you think, will you? The KGW Great Food Drive is underway. We've provided around 8,000 meals so far, but our goal is way higher than that, 1.2 million. Last year, as many as 1 in 8 Oregonians sought food assistance. You can give online now at kgw.com/fooddrive. And all this week, Rivermark Community Credit Union will double your donation, so take advantage of that. We also want to thank local Toyota dealers, Pacific Office Automation, and Safeway for supporting this year's food drive. All right, keep sending your questions and comments to the story at kgw.com. We see them coming in. We'll finish the show right after this. Well, that's the end of our show. Thanks so much for watching. And remember, the story, our story, that never